My name is Sienna, and I am 33 years old. 7 years ago, my stepmother and biological father handed my half-sister $500,000 to start her dream business. When I asked for help with my law school tuition, I was told to pack my bags because I was just wasting space in their house. I walked out with nothing and never looked back. But karma has a funny way of catching up. When my sister's business completely collapsed, she was forced to move back into her childhood bedroom. And when she drove past my $12 million beachfront villa, she broke down crying, screaming at her mother, asking why I get to have everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to hear what happened next. The screeching tires of a heavily dented white Range Rover shattered the quiet Tuesday morning outside my gated estate in Newport, Rhode Island. I was standing on the second-floor balcony of my master suite holding my morning espresso when I looked down at the street below. The luxury vehicle jerked to a violent halt right in front of my custom wrought iron gates. The passenger side door flew open and my half-sister Brittany stumbled out onto the pavement. At 30 years old, she still threw tantrums like a toddler. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, her designer clothes looked slept in, and her face was streaked with running mascara. She collapsed onto the manicured brick driveway, sobbing hysterically as she stared up at the sheer scale of my property. The panoramic ocean, views, the pristine modern architecture, the wraparound glass balconies. It was a physical manifestation of everything she felt entitled to, but had failed to achieve. She pointed a shaking finger at my home, wailing at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with raw jealousy. It was a pathetic display, but I felt absolutely no pity. I just took a slow sip of my espresso and watched the inevitable breakdown unfold. The driver's side door slammed shut, and my stepmother Patricia marched toward my gate. Even at 58, facing absolute financial ruin, she was desperately clinging to the illusion of Greenwich Country Club royalty. She wore a tailored blazer that had seen better days, and her usual perfectly manicured demeanor had completely evaporated. Patricia grabbed the heavy iron bars of my gate and began shaking them, her knuckles turning white. "Sienna," she screamed, her voice echoing over the sound of the crashing waves behind my house. "Open this gate right now. I know you are in there. You stole the family trust to buy this place, did you not? 7 years ago, I told you that you were just wasting space in my house, and you have been holding a grudge ever since. You have been plotting to ruin your sister from the very beginning." Her accusations were as predictable as they were absurd. I had not stolen a single dime. I had built Coastal Development Group from the ground up, turning a small real estate flipping venture into a massive development firm. But Patricia could never accept that the stepdaughter she threw away like garbage had outsmarted and outworked her precious golden child. "You think you are so smart," Patricia continued to yell, her face turning a blotchy shade of crimson. "Brittany is suffering. Her organic skincare line is struggling because of market manipulation, and you are living in a mansion bought with our money. You set her up. You probably paid off her vendors to sabotage her supply chain. Look at her. She is losing everything." I watched Brittany heave on the pavement, clutching her knockoff purse as if it were a life preserver. My biological father, William, was conspicuously absent, likely hiding back in their heavily mortgaged colonial estate in Connecticut. He was always too cowardly to face the daughter he had abandoned. He had always let Patricia fight his battles, nodding along as she dismantled my self-esteem piece by piece during my childhood. When I was 26, they had literally tossed my belongings onto the front lawn in the pouring rain, laughing as I dragged 2 wet trash bags to my beaten sedan. Patricia had stood on the porch that night sipping a martini, telling me that losers did not deserve a place under her roof. Now she was standing outside my gates demanding access to my sanctuary. "I am calling the police," Patricia threatened, rattling the iron bars again. "I will tell them you embezzled from the estate. I will have you audited. We will take this house and sell it to save Brittany's brand. It belongs to us anyway." I owe you nothing, I thought, setting my espresso cup down on the patio table. It was time to end this ridiculous performance before the neighbors started calling the homeowners association. I turned around, walked through my bedroom, and calmly made my way down the floating glass staircase. I did not rush. I did not feel an ounce of panic. I picked up my customized iPad from the kitchen island, swiped through my security camera feeds, and stepped out the front door. I walked down the paved driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. The ocean breeze caught my hair, but my posture remained perfectly rigid. Patricia stopped screaming the second she saw me approaching. Brittany scrambled to her feet, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, her eyes darting between my designer suit and the massive fountain in my courtyard. They expected me to yell. They wanted a screaming match, a chaotic suburban fight that would validate their unhinged behavior. I stopped a few feet away, separated by cold iron. I offered them a chilling, predatory smile and then pressed it. The heavy iron gate hummed as the digital display panel mounted on the stone pillar flickered. I did not raise my voice or hurl insults. I simply tapped a file on my tablet. A crisp image of a bank transfer receipt illuminated the outdoor screen for Patricia and Brittany to see. The document was dated 7 years ago. The amount was clearly printed in bold black ink for $500,000. The recipient account was listed as Brittany Botanicals. Patricia stared at the screen, her mouth opening silently. Brittany stopped crying and took a step back. That is a copy of the wire transfer my father authorized the morning after you kicked me out into the rain, I said, my voice projecting crystal clear through the intercom system. You forced him to liquidate the entire trust fund my grandfather left for my law school tuition. You handed my entire future to Brittany so she could play business owner and mix organic lotions in a fancy warehouse. You told me I was wasting space. You said I lacked the ambition to ever make a name for myself. Patricia gripped the bars of the gate. That money was ours to invest as a family. We made a strategic decision to back a brand with real market potential. I smiled down at her from the balcony. A strategic decision that yielded zero returns. You see, Patricia, I did not need your stolen money. I built Coastal Development Group with my bare hands. I flipped small commercial spaces while sleeping in my car. I earned every single brick of this $12 million property, without a dime from my cowardly father. Your daughter, on the other hand, did exactly what I predicted she would do. She treated her corporate accounts like a personal piggy bank. Brittany wiped her eyes aggressively. My business is just going through a restructuring phase. The market is tough right now. The market is fine, I replied instantly. Your business is bankrupt because you charged 4 different Birkin bags to the company credit card. You expensed first-class flights to Dubai under the guise of sourcing ingredients. You paid marketing firms thousands of dollars every month just to buy fake followers so you could pretend to be a successful founder. You did not build a company, Brittany. You funded a delusion, and now all the money is completely gone. Before Brittany could stutter out another pathetic lie, the passenger side door of the battered Range Rover creaked open. Malik stepped out onto the driveway. He was an African-American financial analyst who had always been the lone voice of reason in that house of mirrors. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, but his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight, and he clutched a leather briefcase tight against his chest. He looked completely exhausted. Malik approached the gate, rubbing his temples as he looked up at me. He was clearly stressed, but still trying to maintain his professional, demanding tone. Sienna, listen to me, Malik said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I know there is bad blood between you and your parents. I know they wronged you, but she is your sister. We are family. You cannot just stand up there and watch her lose everything she worked for. I leaned against the glass railing, watching him perform his duty as the supportive husband. We just need a temporary bridge loan, Malik continued, his voice growing desperate. The company is facing a cash flow issue. You have a $12 million asset sitting right here on the coast. It is completely paid off. You could easily leverage your house to sign a $2 million line of credit for us. It would give Brittany just enough capital to get through the quarter, restructure the debt, and save the brand. We would pay you back with interest." He stared at me through the iron bars, expecting me to yield to the pressure of family duty. He honestly believed he was negotiating a standard corporate bailout. He thought this was just a temporary dip in their finances. He had absolutely no idea what kind of mess he had married into. I looked quietly down at Malik. My initial cold amusement faded away entirely, replaced by a wave of genuine pity for the man. He was standing there in his expensive suit, begging his estranged sister to save a business that had never actually existed outside of Instagram filters and fabricated accounting ledgers. He was a smart man, highly educated and respected in his field, but love and loyalty had completely blinded him to the reality of his own household. "Malik," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even and calm, "you are a senior financial analyst. Your entire professional career is built on risk assessment, auditing corporate accounts, and conducting rigorous due diligence before signing any contracts." Malik frowned, his hands dropping to his sides. He looked confused by my sudden shift in conversation. "Yes," he replied defensively. "I know how to structure a loan. That is exactly why I am telling you this is a safe investment." I shook my head slowly, gripping the smooth glass railing of my balcony. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" I asked softly. "Because if you are such a brilliant numbers guy, I have to ask you one very simple question. Did you not check the marital assets before driving all the way up here to beg me for a bailout?" Malik froze. The confident posture he had been trying so hard to maintain instantly evaporated. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Patricia suddenly lurched forward, trying to grab Malik by the arm. "Do not listen to her!" Patricia shrieked, panic lacing every single syllable. But I was not finished. Brittany did not just bankrupt her cosmetic company, Malik. She dug a massive financial grave right under your feet, and you are standing directly inside it. "What do you mean, marital assets?" Malik asked, his voice losing its professional edge. He stepped closer to the gate, his fingers gripping the cold iron bars. "Sienna, stop talking in riddles. We share a bank account. I manage all of our household finances. There is absolutely no financial grave." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head at his naive confidence. "You manage the finances that Brittany allows you to see, Malik. You are a senior financial analyst, yet you never once noticed the glaring discrepancies in your own property records. Did you really think her failing organic lotion brand was staying afloat on hopes and dreams for the past 18 months? Malik blinked, his eyes darting toward Brittany, who had suddenly gone completely rigid. "Brittany Botanicals secured a private vendor line of credit," Malik said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "She showed me the approval paperwork." "She showed you a digital document she manipulated on her laptop," I replied smoothly, leaning closer to the gate so he could hear every syllable. "Vendors require hard collateral, Malik. They require tangible assets when a company shows zero profit and a massive cash burn rate. They require real estate." "Our townhouse is not tied to her business," Malik stated firmly. "I made absolutely sure of that before we got married. We established a clear separation of assets." "You had a clear separation of assets," I corrected him, "right up until 6 months ago." Brittany realized the massive vendor bills were finally coming due. Her suppliers were threatening to halt production entirely. She needed liquid cash immediately to keep up the fake appearance of a thriving lifestyle brand. So she went to a secondary lender. The kind of lender who does not ask too many questions as long as the paperwork looks completely legitimate. Malik swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. "What exactly did she do, Sienna?" I looked directly into his eyes, dropping the heavy truth. "She took out a massive second mortgage on your own marital townhouse, Malik. She leveraged the only major asset you two currently own together to pay off her cosmetic company vendors. And since your name is on the primary deed, she needed your permission. But since she knew you would never agree to leverage your home for a failing business, she forged your signature on the official loan documents. Patricia shrieked, her voice cutting through the salty coastal air like a siren. She lunged forward, grabbing Malik by his tailored sleeve and attempting to physically pull him away from the gate. She is lying, Malik. Do not listen to a single word coming out of her mouth. Sienna is just a jealous liar trying to ruin our family and destroy your perfect marriage. Brittany finally snapped out of her frozen state. She rushed to her husband's side, her face a mask of manufactured panic and desperate innocence. Her hands flew to Malik's chest, grasping his lapels as she put on the performance of a lifetime. "Baby, you know me," Brittany cried, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. "You know I would never do something like that behind your back. Sienna has hated me since we were children. She is just trying to tear us apart because she is miserable and alone in this giant empty house. She is making all of this up to get back at Mom for kicking her out." Malik looked down at his wife, his expression caught between desperate hope and terrifying doubt. His sharp, analytical mind was already silently processing the missing bank statements, the sudden influx of expensive inventory, the secretive phone calls Brittany took in the middle of the long night. He wanted to believe her, but the hidden numbers were finally adding up in his head. "Do not ever let her poison your mind," Patricia ordered, pointing a manicured finger at me through the iron bars. "This is exactly what she does. She is a venomous snake trying to infect us with her lies. Tell her to shut up and co-sign the bridge loan right now so we can leave this awful place and go back home in absolute peace." I did not argue with Patricia or engage with Brittany's ridiculous theatrical performance. Debating liars is a complete waste of breath. Instead, I simply lifted my tablet and tapped the screen once. "Malik, I suggest you check your personal email account right now," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over their frantic screaming. "I just forwarded you a digital copy of a document I received from an associate at your mortgage lender." Instantly, the quiet chime of a notification emanated from Malik's jacket pocket. He reached inside with trembling fingers, pulling out his smartphone. Brittany lunged for the device, her eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. "Do not open it, Malik," she shrieked, clawing at his forearm. "Please do not look at it. She sent a virus. It is a trick." Malik easily swatted her hands away, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. He opened the email, and the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and entirely broken. It was not just a copy of the forged loan documents. It was an official notice from the Internal Revenue Service. "It is a notice of intent to levy," I explained calmly, watching his world collapse in real time. "Because Brittany did not just forge your signature for a second mortgage, she also stopped paying the payroll taxes for her company 6 months ago. The federal government is about to seize your bank accounts, garnish your wages, and place a massive lien on your heavily mortgaged townhouse." Malik stared at his wife in pure horror, the reality of his ruined financial future crashing down. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were completely drowned out by the sudden piercing wail of police sirens approaching rapidly in the distance. I smiled. I called them for trespassing. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers painted the front of my estate as officers escorted a screaming Patricia and a sobbing Brittany into the back of a squad car. Malik had already walked away down the coastal road without looking back at his wife. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend of the coastal highway, picked up my empty espresso cup, and walked back inside my perfectly quiet house. The rest of my day was spent closing a highly profitable commercial lease in downtown Providence. I did not give my family another passing thought. But peace is a rare commodity when you are related to desperate people. At exactly 9 o'clock that night, I was sitting in my home office reviewing architectural blueprints when my private cell phone vibrated across the mahogany desk. The screen displayed the name William. My biological father had not called me in 7 years, not when I passed the bar exam, not when I launched my development firm, not when I was featured in business magazines. I tapped the screen and put him on speakerphone. Sienna, we need to talk right now, William barked. There was no greeting, no inquiry about how I was doing, no apology for his wife and daughter trespassing on my property and trying to extort me earlier that morning. His voice carried the same hollow corporate authority he used to bully his junior analysts. Patricia is in tears, and Brittany is facing absolute ruin. You caused a massive scene today. The police scanners are public Sienna. Half the members at the Greenwich Country Club already know my wife was questioned by local authorities. The rumors about an IRS tax lien are spreading through my social circle like a wildfire. I have a reputation to maintain. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice perfectly level. You are calling to complain about your country club reputation, William. Your daughter committed wire fraud and tax evasion. Your wife tried to shake me down for a $2 million bridge loan. I simply called the authorities to remove trespassers from my property. You need to fix this, he demanded, completely ignoring my logic. You have a $12 million house, which means you have liquid capital. I need you to wire the funds to clear Brittany's tax debt by tomorrow morning. We have to make this IRS issue vanish before it hits the local papers and ruins my standing with the club board. You are going to write a check, and you are going to do it to protect this family. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the sheer audacity of his demand hang in the silence. I am not writing a check to cover your daughter's criminal behavior, I replied. William scoffed loudly into the receiver. You owe us, Sienna. We put a roof over your head. We raised you. You owe this family your loyalty. My grip tightened on the edge of the desk. Loyalty. I repeated the word, tasting like ash. Let me remind you what your loyalty looks like, William. 7 years ago, I was 26 years old. I had just lost my entry-level job because the firm downsized. I asked you for exactly 1 month of rent to keep me on my feet while I interviewed. Instead of helping your own daughter, you stood silently on the front porch while Patricia threw my belongings out the front door in the middle of a torrential downpour. I remember the freezing rain soaking through my thin jacket. I remember scrambling on my hands and knees on the wet driveway, frantically stuffing my clothes into 2 cheap black trash bags before they were ruined. I looked up at you, begging you for just 1 week to figure things out. You did not say a single word. You just stood there, adjusted your expensive Rolex watch, turned your back, and let Patricia slam the heavy oak door right in my face. You watched me drag those 2 wet trash bags down the street in the dark. That is exactly how much you cared about putting a roof over my head. I do not owe you a single dime, I stated with absolute ice-cold composure. I am not a bank for your vanity projects, and I will not finance the illusion of your perfect suburban life. You can tell your wife and your golden child that my wallet is permanently closed. There was a heavy, ragged silence on the other end of the line. When William finally spoke again, the polished corporate manager facade had completely cracked, revealing the desperate, vicious man beneath. You think you are untouchable because you bought a fancy house on the beach, he hissed, his voice vibrating with pure malice. You are making a massive mistake, Sienna. You forgot who you are dealing with. I have spent 30 years building connections with the oldest money and the most powerful real estate developers on the East Coast. I know the zoning board directors. I know the private equity investors who fund your coastal development projects. If you do not wire that money to Brittany by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will personally make sure you lose everything. I will call in every favor I have. I will completely blacklist your firm from every major commercial contract in New England. I will make sure your investors pull their funding by the end of the week. You have no idea the kind of absolute hell I can rain down upon you. You are nothing without this family name, he shouted, his breath catching in his throat from the sheer exertion of his unhinged suburban rage. I will destroy your company's reputation so thoroughly that you will be back on the street dragging those 2 trash bags again. Do not test me, Sienna. I will ruin you. The line went dead with a sharp click. I lowered my phone and simply smiled. My father's empty threats of complete social destruction did not materialize the next morning. My firm did not lose a single investor, and my commercial contracts remained firmly secured. William had severely overestimated his outdated influence in a modern market that values actual capital over dusty country club memberships. But my family has never been one to accept defeat gracefully. When brute force fails, they pivot to theatrical manipulation. 2 weeks after the disastrous standoff at my front gate, my mother decided to take matters into her own manicured hands. Patricia had always viewed social pressure as the ultimate weapon. If she could not bully me privately, she would attempt to corner me publicly. She leveraged her position on the Greenwich Country Club Planning Committee to hastily organize a lavish philanthropic event. She dubbed it the inaugural Women in Business Charity Gala. The stated goal was to raise capital for female entrepreneurs facing economic hardship. The actual goal was far more transparent to anyone paying attention. She was manufacturing a highly visible stage to orchestrate a public bailout for Britney. Patricia spent weeks frantically calling every wealthy socialite, local politician, and real estate developer in Fairfield County. She promised a night of unparalleled networking and philanthropy. She rented the grand ballroom, hired a catering team, and booked a string quartet. She was spending money she absolutely did not have, likely maxing out whatever credit lines William had left, all to create an inescapable trap. She knew I operated in circles that valued corporate social responsibility. She knew my clients would be watching. Patricia was banking on the assumption that I would rather comply with her demands than risk an ugly, highly publicized family scandal in front of the exact demographics my development firm catered to. She fundamentally misunderstood how little I cared about the whispers of desperate housewives. Patricia refused to accept that her exiled daughter had permanently closed the bank vault. She convinced herself that my refusal was merely a private temper tantrum. In her mind, the presence of cameras, journalists, and high-net-worth peers would force me to perform the role of the dutiful, generous daughter. She spent her days circulating through the country club dining room, dropping heavy hints about a massive surprise donor who would be anchoring the entire event. She was setting the main board, preparing to force my hand through sheer societal expectation. The true depth of her ambush became apparent when my assistant walked into my office holding the Sunday edition of the Regional Business Journal. A full-page advertisement dominated the social section. The bold gold lettering proudly announced the upcoming Women in Business Charity Gala. Right below the event details, taking up a massive portion of the page, was my corporate logo. Patricia had unilaterally listed Coastal Development Group as the platinum title sponsor. She had leaked the sponsorship details to the press without ever securing my consent, sending a forged confirmation email from a dummy account to the event organizers. The advertisement explicitly stated that my firm would be presenting a highly anticipated flagship grant to a struggling local cosmetic brand at the climax of the evening. The trap was meticulously set. By publishing my company's involvement in a respected business journal, Patricia had painted me into a corner. If I issued a public denial and pulled out of the charity event, I would look like a heartless corporate villain actively crushing a philanthropic endeavor aimed at empowering women. If I simply did not show up, the resulting gossip would frame me as an unreliable flake who backed out of a major charitable commitment. She honestly believed she had outsmarted me. She calculated that I would quietly absorb the furious indignation attend her little country club masquerade and write a massive camera-ready check to Britney Botanicals just to protect my firm's pristine public image. She was attempting to extort $2 million from me under the impenetrable guise of female empowerment and charitable giving. Patricia assumed my deep desire to save face among my wealthy peers would completely override my absolute refusal to fund my sister's fraudulent lifestyle. She was weaponizing my own corporate success directly against me. 30 minutes after the article went live, a thick envelope arrived at my office via private courier. It contained a gold-embossed VIP invitation and a sickly sweet handwritten note from Patricia expressing how thrilled the family was to finally publicly celebrate my success. My public relations director immediately marched into my suite, drafting a press release to aggressively deny our involvement and threaten the publication with a defamation lawsuit. I raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I instructed him to completely discard the press release. I did not want a single word of denial issued to the media or the country club. I wanted Patricia to believe her manipulative ambush had worked flawlessly. Instead of calling my public relations department, I picked up my phone and called the senior partners at my corporate legal firm. I ordered them to drop everything they were doing. We spent the next 72 hours compiling a very specific type of paperwork. We gathered documents, verified financial records, and legally sealed the evidence of the exact crimes Brittany had committed. If my mother wanted a public spectacle, I was going to deliver a performance they would never forget. On the evening of the gala, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. I bypassed the evening gowns and slipped into my sharpest, most intimidating tailored black suit. I secured my hair, checked my reflection, and picked up a sleek leather portfolio from my bed. Inside was not a check to bail out Brittany Botanicals. It was a very special, legally binding donation prepared exclusively for my treacherous family. I stepped out into the crisp, cool evening air, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car, completely ready to absolutely obliterate their fragile world. The Greenwich Country Club Grand Ballroom was a masterclass in performative philanthropy and suffocating suburban opulence. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and imported hydrangeas choked the tables, while crystal chandeliers cast a warm, forgiving light over the glittering crowd of Fairfield County's elite. Waitstaff in crisp black tuxedos circulated through the sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits, offering silver trays of champagne and caviar canapes. It was a flawless facsimile of charitable grace, entirely funded by credit lines, teetering on the edge of default. At the center of this fabricated elegance stood Patricia, orchestrating the room with the practiced precision of a seasoned politician. She was draped in sapphire silk, a smile painted across her face, as she paraded Brittany from cluster to cluster. Brittany played her assigned role to absolute perfection. She wore a modest pale pink dress that screamed vulnerable but brave female entrepreneur, casting her eyes downward appropriately whenever a local real estate developer or hedge fund manager offered their sympathies. They were working the crowd methodically, ensuring every high net worth individual in attendance heard their carefully crafted narrative. I watched from the shadows of the vestibule as Patricia leaned in close to a prominent venture capitalist, her voice pitched at the exact volume necessary to be overheard by surrounding tables. She spun a tragic but ultimately triumphant tale of family unity. She lamented the current brutal economic climate for small business owners, sighing heavily about the unfair struggles Brittany Botanicals was facing. With a dramatic hand pressed to her heart, Patricia delivered the punchline. She proudly announced that her estranged, wildly successful daughter, the founder of Coastal Development Group, was finally coming to her senses. She told the captivated audience that I was arriving tonight to personally rescue the family business, with a massive capital injection, proving that blood is thicker than any corporate balance sheet. She painted herself as the patient matriarch who had finally brought her wandering, stubborn daughter back into the loving fold. The guests nodded in approval, completely oblivious to the fact that they were serving as unwitting props in a desperate extortion scheme. Patricia was locking in the social pressure, ensuring that when I finally walked through those heavy oak doors, the collective expectation of the room would force me into compliance. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the ballroom. I did not wear a flowing ball gown or a cocktail dress designed to blend into the sea of pastel silk and chiffon. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored black suit that cut a severe, uncompromising silhouette against the opulent backdrop. My hair was pulled back tight, and my heels struck the polished marble floor with the definitive crack of a gavel. The immediate shift in the room's energy was palpable. The lively chatter closest to the entrance faltered, then died away entirely as heads turned in my direction. The crowd naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path as I strode onto the main floor. I did not smile, and I did not offer polite nods to the whispering onlookers. I carried an aura of absolute ruthless authority, holding a thick manila envelope loosely in my left hand. Before I could make it 10 paces into the ballroom, William intercepted me. He materialized from behind a pillar, his face flushed and a muscle jumping erratically along his jawline. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight enough to bruise, and leaned close. His voice was a harsh whisper intended only for my ears. "What are you wearing?" he hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the nearby guests who were openly staring. "You look like you are going to a funeral, not a charity gala." I pulled my arm out of his grasp with a sharp jerk. "Do not touch me, William." He masked his rage with a tight smile for the audience, gesturing toward a set of double doors leading to the private dining rooms. "We need to go to the back room right now, Sienna. We are going to handle the financial transfer privately before your mother calls you up to the stage. You are going to sign the documents, and then you are going to smile for the cameras. It is time to drop the attitude and do what you are told." I planted my feet firmly on the Italian marble, refusing to move a single inch toward the private rooms. "I am not going anywhere with you, William," I stated, my voice carrying clearly over the soft string quartet playing in the background. "I am staying right here in the center of the room. You wanted a public spectacle, and I am here to attend the main event." William's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to issue another threat, but the sudden piercing screech of microphone feedback cut him off. Patricia stood at the center of the mahogany stage, tapping the microphone to command the room's absolute attention. The string quartet faded into silence as hundreds of guests turned toward the spotlight. Patricia beamed radiating maternal warmth as her eyes scanned the crowd and locked directly onto me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia announced, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom, "tonight is about empowering women to overcome insurmountable odds. As many of you know, my youngest daughter, Brittany, has built an incredible organic brand from the ground up. But tonight is also about family. I am beyond thrilled to announce that our platinum title sponsor is Coastal Development Group." She threw her arm out, pointing straight at me, while the crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. "I want to invite my brilliant daughter Sienna up to the stage to present the sponsorship check and secure the future of Brittany Botanicals." The spotlight swung around, illuminating me. I did not hesitate. I stepped away from a horrified William and walked confidently up the center aisle. I ascended the stage stairs, gripping the thick manila envelope, and smiled directly at the flashing cameras. I stepped up to the mahogany podium, the bright glare of the spotlight catching the silver hardware of my tailored suit. Patricia was beaming beside me, her hands clasped together in a perfect display of manufactured maternal pride. She held the microphone out to me like a trophy. I took it, my fingers wrapping firmly around the cold metal, and turned to face the glittering sea of Fairfield County's elite. The room was packed with venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and socialites, all waiting for the heartwarming climax of the evening. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the grand ballroom. The polite chatter died down completely. "I want to thank Patricia for that incredibly generous introduction. It is truly an honor to be standing here tonight surrounded by such distinguished peers to discuss the remarkable business practices of my family." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the front row, where William was sitting stiffly, his face a mask of anxious calculation. "We are gathered here to celebrate female entrepreneurship and financial ingenuity. And when it comes to unbelievable creativity and financial management, I must admit, my family is absolutely unparalleled." A ripple of polite, appreciative laughter rolled through the crowd. Men in expensive tuxedos nodded, assuming I was making a clever inside joke about savvy corporate tax strategies and aggressive wealth management. Patricia smiled even wider, leaning in close to my shoulder to bask in the glow of my apparent compliance. She completely missed the razor-sharp edge hiding beneath my words. Brittany stood just a few feet away, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, her eyes fixed hungrily on the thick manila envelope resting in my left hand. They have spent the last 18 months demonstrating a level of financial maneuvering that would leave even the most seasoned Wall Street auditors entirely speechless. I continued, my tone smooth and commanding. They have redefined the concept of leveraging assets. They have shown a truly breathtaking commitment to securing capital by any means necessary, regardless of the conventional rules or standard regulations that govern the rest of us. The audience clapped enthusiastically. They loved a story about relentless drive and disruptive business tactics. They clapped for a cosmetic brand they thought was a triumph of modern ingenuity. They were completely unaware of the absolute poison dripping from every single syllable I spoke. I lowered the microphone slightly and turned to face Patricia. Her sapphire silk dress shimmered under the stage lights as she eagerly reached out her manicured hands. I held out the thick manila envelope. She grabbed it with the frantic energy of a starving woman completely abandoning her polished country club poise. The crowd watched in breathless silence, waiting for the dramatic reveal of a multi-million-dollar corporate check. Patricia tore at the metal clasp, her acrylic nails scraping against the heavy paper. She slid the contents out, already preparing to hold the document high above her head for the press photographers lined up at the back of the room. But as her eyes focused on the bold black lettering at the top of the first page, her triumphant smile instantly vanished. The color drained from her face so quickly she looked physically ill. Her hands began to shake violently, the heavy parchment rattling in her grip. It was not a ceremonial bank check. It was a massive, legally binding stack of federal subpoenas. The top document was a formal cease and desist order filed by the elite corporate litigation team at Coastal Development Group. The headers explicitly outlined charges of wire fraud, criminal extortion, and the unauthorized fraudulent use of a corporate trademark for financial gain. You did not think I would actually let you use my company logo to run a suburban extortion racket, did you? I asked, my voice pitched so low that only she and Brittany could hear me. I watched the absolute terror flood Patricia's eyes as she scanned the dense legal text. Every single lie she had told to the event organizers, every forged confirmation email she had sent to secure the venue, and every piece of fraudulent advertising she had published in the regional business journal was meticulously documented and attached as hard evidence. Brittany leaned over her mother's shoulder to look at the papers. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. The golden child finally realized there was no safety net waiting to catch her. The IRS was already freezing her bank accounts, and now my legal team was preparing to drag her through a brutal, highly publicized criminal trial. Patricia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own destruction. She had built a cage for me, and I had simply locked the door from the outside. I turned my back on their horrified faces and raised the microphone one last time. The ballroom was utterly silent, the guests sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere on the stage. Let me be absolutely clear. I announced, my voice slicing through the stagnant air of the grand ballroom like a freshly sharpened blade. I am not the platinum title sponsor of this event. I have never authorized the use of my trademark for this fraudulent gathering, and I am certainly not funding Brittany Botanicals. I paused, letting the truth sink into the minds of every wealthy investor in the room. I am, however, sponsoring an aggressive criminal defense attorney for my stepmother and my sister, because they will desperately need one by tomorrow morning. Absolute chaos exploded. A blinding wave of camera flashbulbs erupted from the press pool, illuminating the stage in rapid strobing bursts of harsh white light. Patricia let out a breathless, humiliated sob, dropping the thick stack of legal documents. The subpoenas scattered across the mahogany stage like fallen leaves. From the front row, William let out a furious roar and lunged for the microphone. The flashbulbs were still searing my retinas as I walked out of the Greenwich Country Club, leaving William wrestling with a dead microphone and Patricia hyperventilating on the mahogany stage. By sunrise, the fallout was absolute. The local news blogs and regional business journals had a field day. Headlines plastered across social media painted a vivid picture of the Coastal Development Group CEO serving federal subpoenas to her own family at a charity gala. Brittany Botanicals was instantly radioactive. Distributors canceled their contracts before breakfast, and the country club elite who had sipped free champagne the night before completely vanished. My phone began ringing precisely at 7 in the morning. The caller ID flashed William's name, and I answered, placing the phone on my pristine glass desk. He did not say hello. He launched into a completely unhinged tirade, his voice cracking with a level of pure rage I had never heard from him before. He screamed that I was a monster, a vindictive sociopath who had systematically plotted to destroy the only people who had ever cared about me. He blamed me for the sudden freeze on their bank accounts and the immediate social exile they were now experiencing. He shrieked that Patricia was heavily sedated and Brittany was refusing to leave her childhood bedroom. He demanded that I publicly retract the cease and desist order and issue a formal apology to the press, claiming the entire display was a theatrical misunderstanding meant to raise awareness for the charity. I listened to his desperate delusional rant while reviewing my morning stock reports. He actually believed he could yell loud enough to reverse a federal investigation. When he finally ran out of breath, gasping for air over the line, I simply told him to direct all further communication to my legal department and disconnected the call. They had manufactured a fraudulent stage to publicly corner me, and they were completely incapable of handling the reality that I had bulldozed their entire house of cards. The social isolation was immediate and brutal. Their affluent friends blocked their numbers, and the country club mysteriously suspended their membership pending an internal review of the gala's financing. They were drowning in the exact public scandal they had tried to weaponize against me, but instead of accepting defeat, they doubled down on their delusion. 3 days after the disastrous gala, a private process server arrived at the Coastal Development Group headquarters. My executive assistant handed me a thick, aggressively stapled legal packet. My family had scraped together the last of their liquidated assets to hire Richard Sterling, a notoriously sleazy high-volume litigation attorney, known for turning family disputes into prolonged, agonizing media circuses. Sterling had built his entire career on extortion, masquerading as civil litigation, and he had drafted a completely absurd countersuit against me. They were suing me for $5 million. The documents cited egregious defamation of character, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and tortious interference with a business contract. The narrative Sterling spun in the filing was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. He claimed that I had been insanely jealous of Brittany's rising success as an organic entrepreneur. He argued that I had maliciously orchestrated her entire downfall by hacking into her business accounts, planting false evidence of wire fraud, and fabricating the trademark infringement just to humiliate her on a public stage. The lawsuit completely ignored the very real federal subpoenas and focused entirely on painting me as a ruthless corporate titan, crushing her sweet, innocent younger sister out of pure spite. They were demanding the $5 million as immediate compensation for the catastrophic damage done to the Brittany Botanicals brand and the severe psychological trauma inflicted upon Patricia. William and Patricia honestly believed that the threat of a messy, drawn-out public trial would force me to quietly settle. They calculated that my board of directors would panic at the negative press and demand that I pay them off to make the story disappear. Sterling began aggressively leaking snippets of the lawsuit to local gossip columns, framing my family as the helpless victims of my corporate greed. They thought they had found a new leverage point, a way to extract the exact amount of money they needed to pay off their mounting debts and flee the state. It was a pathetic, desperate gamble from people who still fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I did not feel remotely threatened by Richard Sterling or his fabricated legal claims. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction knowing they had just handed me the final shovel they would use to dig their own graves. The following morning, Richard Sterling's office issued a formal summons. They demanded a sit-down negotiation in their downtown boardroom, offering me one final chance to settle the matter quietly before they officially filed the lawsuit with the county court and took the entire circus to the national media. They wanted me to write the $5 million check, drop the trademark dispute, and sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. The summons explicitly stated that if I refused, they would depose every member of my executive team and drag my company through a grueling, highly publicized trial. I read the summons twice, a sharp smile spreading across my face. I instructed my legal team to accept the meeting immediately. I agreed to their location and their specified time, offering absolutely no pushback on the initial terms of the sit-down. I sent a single brief email to Sterling confirming my attendance, adding only one specific condition to the arrangement. I explicitly requested that Malik Brittany's former supplier and the man they had deeply defrauded for many long months be physically present in the boardroom for what I officially termed the final financial disclosures. The stage was perfectly set for their absolute destruction. I was going to thoroughly dismantle their fragile, pathetic illusion of control and leave them with absolutely nothing but the cold, crushing truth. The massive glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Richard Sterling's Manhattan legal firm was meticulously designed to intimidate opposing counsel. It offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but the atmosphere inside felt as cold as a surgical theater. The temperature was set uncomfortably low, chilling the air circulating around the massive mahogany table dominating the space. Patricia, William, and Brittany sat on one side, flanked by Sterling, forming a united front of unearned arrogance. They dressed impeccably, radiating the absolute false confidence of people who truly believed they had successfully cornered their vulnerable prey. Patricia wore a tailored cream suit, her posture rigid, and her chin lifted in a display of maternal indignation. Brittany sat beside her, playing the traumatized victim, occasionally dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. William leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smirk playing across his lips as he surveyed the room. At the far end of the long table sat Malik. He looked entirely out of place among the designer suits and polished veneer. He wore a simple button-down shirt, the fabric wrinkled, and heavy bags hung beneath his eyes, betraying months of sleepless nights and financial panic. He looked exhausted, his posture defensive as he cast deeply suspicious glances toward my family. He had no idea why I demanded his presence at a high-stakes settlement negotiation, only that Coastal Development Group had insisted it concerned the unpaid invoices bankrupting his supply business. I sat directly across from my family, completely still, observing the scene with absolute detachment. Beside me, my lead corporate counsel remained silent, his hands resting lightly on the brass latches of a black briefcase. The tension in the room was thick enough to suffocate a fire. Sterling loudly cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie with a theatrical flourish before leaning aggressively forward. He slapped a thick binder onto the table, the sharp crack echoing off the glass walls. "Let us dispense with pleasantries," Sienna Sterling began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have created an absolute unmitigated nightmare for my clients. Your stunt at the country club was a masterclass in defamation, and the resulting media circus has caused catastrophic damage to Brittany Botanicals." Patricia sighed loudly, shaking her head. "You always had to ruin everything, Sienna," she interjected, her tone laced with practiced disappointment. "You could never stand to see your sister succeed without trying to tear her down. It is a sickness." Sterling held up a hand, silencing her. "My clients are fully prepared to offer you a generous way out of the terrible public relations disaster you initiated," he continued, sliding a single sheet of paper across the mahogany surface. "We are willing to drop the $5 million lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress and tortious interference. In exchange, you will issue a public retraction of your baseless fraud claims, clear Brittany's name in the press, and provide the $5 million as a compensatory settlement for the contracts she lost due to your erratic behavior." William leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table. "It is a bargain, Sienna," he sneered. "If you refuse, we will tie Coastal Development Group up in court for the next 10 years. We will depose your entire executive board, subpoena every client you have ever worked with, and ensure the press paints you as a vindictive, unstable CEO who uses her corporate power to terrorize her own family. You will lose investors faster than you can count them." You are going to write that check drop this ridiculous charade and sign a non-disclosure agreement forbidding you from ever speaking about this family or Brittany Botanicals again. Sterling tapped the paper with his expensive fountain pen. This is your only escape hatch. If you walk out of this room without signing, I promise you, I will make it my personal mission to see your company dismantled, piece by piece in the public square. You have 24 hours to transfer the funds and issue the apology. They stared at me, waiting for the panic to set in. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, defend my actions, or offer a single word of rebuttal to their aggressive posturing. I simply let the silence stretch out, allowing their empty threats to hang in the freezing air of the conference room. I absorbed their gaslighting and manipulation without blinking, maintaining a calm, unreadable expression. The longer I sat in absolute silence, the more their manufactured confidence began to visibly crack. William shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the smug smirk slowly melting off his face. Patricia crossed and uncrossed her legs, her gaze darting nervously towards Sterling, looking for reassurance. Brittany stopped dabbing her dry eyes and stared at me, a genuine flicker of fear finally breaking through her rehearsed victim routine. They were expecting a fight, a desperate negotiation, or an emotional breakdown. My total refusal to engage disrupted their entire strategy. Beside me, my lawyer moved for the first time since we had entered the room. He did not speak a word. He simply unclasped the brass latches of his black leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room. He slowly opened the lid, reached inside, and retrieved a single thick legal document bound in a heavy blue cover. He placed it carefully on the table in front of me and retreated to his previous posture. I placed my right hand flat against the document. It was not a settlement agreement, and it was most certainly not a $5 million check to save my sister's fraudulent lifestyle. I looked directly past my angry father, past my mother, and past their sleazy attorney. I locked eyes with the exhausted, suspicious man sitting at the far end of the table. Without breaking eye contact with him, I slid the heavily redacted financial ledger across the polished mahogany table directly toward Malik. I kept my hand flat on the table as Malik tentatively pulled the heavy blue ledger toward himself. His exhausted eyes darted between me and the thick binder. I told Sterling I would not argue his ridiculous demands, and I meant it. There is no need for a debate when the math speaks for itself. I looked directly at my sister. Brittany Botanicals did not fail due to a brutal economic climate or an aggressive market competition. It failed because it was never a functioning business to begin with. It was a glorified piggy bank, and you drained it dry. I gestured toward the open binder in front of Malik. Page 4 details the initial seed capital raised from 3 different angel investors. They handed over $1.2 million specifically earmarked for product development and organic supply chain logistics. Page 7 shows where that money actually went. The room was deathly quiet, save for the rustle of paper as Malik flipped to the indicated section. Brittany did not invest a single dime into organic supply chains. She transferred over $400,000 into a secondary unlisted corporate account. From there, she funneled the cash directly into her personal checking. She spent $80,000 chartering private flights to Dubai for a 2-week luxury vacation. She blew $40,000 on designer handbags to wear during that trip. She paid a shady overseas marketing firm $60,000 to purchase millions of fake Instagram followers and deploy automated PR bots to flood her comment sections with manufactured praise. She was not building a cosmetic empire. She was actively embezzling her own investors' capital to fund a lavish, fraudulent reality. She merely bought herself the illusion of absolute social supremacy. Every time an investor requested a quarterly report, William stepped in to falsify the burn rate, covering up the massive holes in the ledger. They created dummy invoices for raw materials that never existed. They burned through the entire $1.2 million in less than 8 months. When the well ran dry, they realized they desperately needed a new victim to keep the party going. Brittany slumped in her leather chair, her face turning an unhealthy shade of chalky white as I methodically exposed every single layer of her criminal theft. Patricia slammed her hands onto the polished mahogany, violently rejecting the reality I had just laid bare. She bolted upright, her perfectly styled hair trembling with indignant fury. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger across the table. "You are looking at those numbers through the narrow, uncultured lens of a corporate drone." Brittany is an influencer. She is the face of a modern brand. In today's market lifestyle, branding is a legitimate business expense. She needs to project success to attract success. The trips to Dubai, the wardrobe, the social media management, that is all standard operating procedure for a cosmetic founder trying to build a global audience. You have to spend money to make money. Patricia glared at me, her chest heaving as she doubled down on the delusion. "You just do not understand modern marketing because you are a bitter, isolated workaholic. You sit in your sterile office all day, counting pennies and ruining relationships while Brittany is out there actually engaging with the world." She was investing in her image, which is the most valuable asset a lifestyle company possesses. It is not embezzlement. It is strategic brand positioning. She was building a network of high-net-worth connections that would have paid off 10 times over if you had not maliciously stepped in to sabotage her momentum. Patricia looked to Sterling for backup, expecting the lawyer to validate her absurd justification of grand larceny. Sterling, however, remained completely silent. His eyes were fixed on the blue ledger in Malik's hands, a dawning realization of pure legal terror slowly washing over his features. He knew exactly what federal prosecutors called strategic brand positioning when it was funded by stolen investor capital. I completely ignored Patricia's frantic outburst. Her shrill excuses evaporated against the cold, hard glass of the conference room walls, leaving zero impact on my composure. I did not even spare her a glance. Instead, I kept my focus locked entirely on the exhausted man sitting at the far end of the long table. Malik was staring at the numbers, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. "Malik," I said, my voice cutting through the lingering echoes of Patricia's tantrum. "Look at page 12. I watched his calloused fingers turn the heavy pages. He supplied the only legitimate aspect of Brittany Botanicals. He provided the raw organic ingredients they needed to produce their first mock-up batches, importing high-grade essential oils and botanical extracts on credit. He had trusted William's assurances that payment was delayed due to standard banking holds. He had nearly bankrupted his own small supply business, trying to keep their operation afloat, believing he was partnering with a reputable, well-funded enterprise. They did not just burn investor money, I told him, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register. They burned yours. I watched the sickening realization hit him like a brutal physical blow. The crushing weight of their deception settled heavily upon his slumped shoulders. The essential money he had literally begged them for every single week, the payments he needed to keep his own warehouse open and his employees paid, had never been tied up in banking delays. It had been recklessly spent on first-class tickets, luxury hotel suites, and entirely fake internet points designed to fool everyone. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany. "I want you to look closely at the very last page, Malik. Look at exactly what William did with the final remaining $50,000 of your capital." Malik slowly opened the heavy ledger to the final page and completely stopped breathing. Malik stared at the page, the color completely draining from his face. His eyes darted rapidly across the columns of numbers, tracking the flow of capital with the sharp, panicked precision of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing on a landmine. While he had spent years managing logistics and raw materials for his supply business, Malik also handled his own corporate accounting and understood financial structuring perfectly. He knew exactly what a fraudulent holding entity looked like on paper. The heavy blue ledger documented an intricate, highly illegal web of shell companies. Brittany Botanicals was not just a failing cosmetic line, it was the centerpiece of a massive systematic debt-shielding operation. Patricia and Brittany had established a phantom subsidiary registered in Delaware, funneling all of their catastrophic vendor deficits, unfulfilled contract liabilities, and mounting loan defaults directly into this hollow corporate shell. They had aggressively siphoned the remaining operating capital into offshore private trusts, leaving the domestic entity loaded with millions of dollars in toxic debt. But that was not what made Malik stop breathing. It was the guarantor signature line. At the bottom of the meticulously documented corporate charter, right beneath the staggering sum of $3.8 million in unsecured commercial debt, was his own name. Patricia and Brittany had forged his signature. They had listed Malik's supply business as the primary financial guarantor for the Delaware Shell Company without his knowledge, leveraging his pristine credit history and business assets to secure the loans they had immediately squandered in Dubai. They had tied his entire livelihood, his warehouse, his payroll, and his personal home to their fraudulent subsidiary. If Brittany Botanicals collapsed, the creditors would not go after Patricia's country club memberships or Brittany's designer handbags. They would immediately seize everything Malik owned to satisfy the outstanding balances. He was legally responsible for every single cent of their reckless globe-trotting vanity project. The heavy ledger shook in his hands as the reality of his total financial ruin washed over him. He had spent months begging them for a $50,000 payment to keep his workers employed while they had secretly chained a $3 million anchor around his neck and pushed him off a cliff. He dropped the heavy blue ledger directly back onto the polished glass table, the sharp, echoing thud utterly shattering the unbearable tension hanging inside the freezing room. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. His gaze locked onto Brittany, radiating a terrifying mixture of shock and pure rage. "You forged my name," Malik said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You stole my identity and tied my company to your toxic debt. You made me the sole guarantor for nearly $4 million. Brittany shrank back into her leather chair, her eyes darting nervously towards Sterling for protection. She opened her mouth to speak, but the lie died in her throat under Malik's furious stare. "How could you do this to me?" he demanded, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "I trusted you. I fronted you organic materials when you had absolutely nothing. I kept your supply chain moving when every other vendor cut you off. I nearly bankrupted my family trying to help you build your brand. And you were busy using my business as a human shield for your fraudulent loans." Brittany instantly crumbled, defaulting to her lifelong survival tactic. She buried her face in her hands and burst into loud theatrical sobs. "I did not mean to hurt you," she wailed. "I did not understand what the paperwork meant. Mom told me it was the only way to keep the company alive. She said we just needed a temporary bridge loan to get through the quarter." Patricia jumped in, attempting to run interference for her golden child. "Now listen here, Malik. There is absolutely no need to become hostile," she scolded, adjusting her designer jacket with forced calm. "We were merely protecting Brittany's assets from greedy creditors who wanted to destroy a young entrepreneur. We intended to remove your name from the guarantor line as soon as the next round of venture capital cleared. It was a temporary strategy to weather a difficult financial season. You are completely blowing a standard corporate maneuver entirely out of proportion." Malik stared at Patricia as if she had just grown a second head. "Temporary strategy," he repeated, his voice shaking with absolute disbelief. "You committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You stole my credit rating for private jets. You never protected her assets. You deliberately planned to let me take the fall when your entire Ponzi scheme inevitably collapsed. You intended to let the banks take my warehouse, my home, and my savings, so you could keep your country club memberships." William stood up, holding his hands out in a heavily patronizing gesture of appeasement. He flashed his trademark corporate smile, desperately attempting to smooth over the catastrophic legal exposure with sheer charisma. "Malik, let us all take a deep breath and be rational about this," William said smoothly. "We are all businessmen here. The market took an unexpected downturn, and we had to make a tough executive decision to restructure the debt. We needed to protect the primary brand equity. You are an essential part of the Brittany Botanicals family, Sometimes you just have to take one for the team to protect the family name and ensure long-term profitability. We will make you whole once the company goes public. You just need to hold the line for us a little longer." Malik stared at William, the sick, twisted logic utterly paralyzing him. He finally understood the complete scope of my family's ruthless, absolute depravity. He was not a partner, a trusted friend, or a valued supplier. He was the uniquely designated ultimate fall guy. With a massive federal investigation already bearing down on the company, Malik realized he was currently looking at 10 agonizing years in a federal prison. Malik stared at the page, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the fraud. Patricia did not even give him a moment to process the fact that he was staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison. Instead, she leaned across the mahogany table, her eyes flashing with vicious, cornered desperation. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat against the glass surface, demanding his immediate submission. She ordered Malik to close the ledger and fall in line, her voice echoing through the chilled conference room with absolute authority. She told him he was overreacting to a standard corporate restructuring strategy, spinning the massive embezzlement as a temporary necessity. When Malik did not immediately respond, Patricia dropped the maternal facade and unleashed a torrent of vicious threats. She reminded him exactly who William was in the corporate supply chain ecosystem. She screamed that William had the connections to completely blackball Malik and his logistics company from every major retail distributor on the eastern seaboard. If Malik decided to abandon Brittany now, Patricia swore she would personally ensure his business was dismantled and sold for scrap. She told him that his own wife and children would end up on the street if he dared to testify against the Golden Child. William nodded in silent agreement, crossing his arms and projecting an aura of untouchable wealth. Patricia demanded that Malik absorb the debt, sign whatever Sterling put in front of him, and play his designated role to protect the brand. She shrieked that if he tried to distance himself from Brittany Botanicals, they would bury him under a mountain of fabricated lawsuits until he was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. They were offering him a choice between silent compliance or total professional annihilation, assuming he was too terrified to fight back against their established influence. Malik slowly closed the heavy blue ledger. The thick parchment pages settled together with a final heavy thud that seemed to absorb all the remaining oxygen in the room. He placed his hands flat on the table and pushed himself upward, standing to his full height. He looked entirely transformed. The exhausted, defeated posture he had carried into the room vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. He refused to think of his wife, whom he had texted just hours ago, promising he would find a way to save their home from the crushing debt Brittany had secretly anchored to their names. He refused to look at Brittany, the woman who had smiled in his face while forging his signature on documents that would ruin his children and their future. Instead, Malik reached deliberately into the inner breast pocket of his wrinkled jacket. Patricia stopped her rant, her mouth hanging open in sudden confusion. William dropped his arms, a flicker of genuine alarm finally piercing his arrogant composure. Sterling shifted nervously in his leather chair, his legal instincts screaming that control of the room had just violently shifted. Malik pulled out a small metallic silver flash drive. The overhead lights caught the edge of the metal as he held it between his thumb and forefinger, letting the silence stretch out to an agonizing length. "My family will not end up on the street," Malik said, his voice deadly quiet and completely devoid of the panic Patricia had tried to incite. He bypassed Patricia, William, and Sterling entirely. He kept his gaze locked solely on me, recognizing the only person in the room who possessed the actual power to dismantle their fraudulent empire. With a sharp practice motion, Malik slid the silver flash drive across the polished mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the glass surface, coming to a halt precisely inches from my folded hands. The tiny device contained the absolute destruction of every single lie my family had just attempted to sell. They had pushed a desperate man entirely too far, calculating that fear would enforce his loyalty. They had fundamentally underestimated what a man fighting for his own survival was willing to do. Malik was no longer their compliant victim or their designated fall guy. He was the architect of their immediate downfall. This is every internal email forged signature and deleted bank record from her company. Malik said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a freshly sharpened blade. I have spent the last 3 weeks recovering the digital footprint they thought they had permanently scrubbed. It contains the raw communication logs where William explicitly instructed the accounting software to generate dummy invoices and the exact timestamps of Patricia transferring investor capital into offshore private trusts. It proves I was listed as the primary guarantor without my knowledge, and it details exactly how they planned to leave me holding the bag when the federal auditors arrived. Malik stepped away from his chair, distancing himself from my family and their side of the table. I will testify for you, he continued, maintaining unbroken eye contact with me. I will stand in open court and verify every single document on that drive. I will hand the prosecutors the exact roadmap they need to trace the embezzled funds. Just get me out of this toxic nightmare and I will give you the hammer to smash their entire operation into dust. Sterling turned a sickly shade of gray, immediately realizing the flash drive represented irrefutable hard evidence of organized racketeering. William leaped out of his chair, his face turning an alarming shade of purple, as the reality of impending federal prison time crashed over him. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Brittany erupted, the fragile victim persona shattered, instantly replaced by a vicious, hysterical rage. She shrieked, lunging across the wide mahogany table, her manicured hands clawing frantically toward the silver flash drive, resting safely in front of me as I calmly reached out and pocketed the device before her grasping fingers could ever reach my hands, locking her fate into a cold, permanent, unyielding reality. 3 weeks passed since the disastrous conference room meeting, and the fallout was absolute. Malik's flash drive delivered the fatal blow to Sterling's carefully constructed legal defense. The defamation lawsuit against me evaporated overnight. Sterling formally withdrew as their legal counsel the very next morning, citing a sudden conflict of interest to save his own professional license. Without his high-priced intimidation tactics, the fragile walls protecting Brittany Botanicals completely collapsed. The digital evidence Malik provided did much more than clear my name. It triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that reached the highest levels of the federal government. The Internal Revenue Service moved in with terrifying speed. Armed with irrefutable proof of dummy invoices, falsified vendor contracts, and millions funneled into unlisted offshore accounts, the agency immediately froze all of Brittany's personal and business assets. They slapped massive tax liens on everything tied to her name, demanding immediate repayment of stolen capital gains and imposing crippling penalties for wire fraud. The threat of federal prison hung over Brittany like a guillotine. She spent her days locked in her bedroom at the Greenwich estate, oscillating between hysterical crying fits and catatonic silence. William and Patricia were in a state of absolute blind panic. Their entire reality was built on the illusion of limitless wealth and untouchable status, and that illusion was rapidly disintegrating. They desperately needed liquid cash. They needed millions of dollars to pay off the immediate tax liens, hire a specialized federal criminal defense team to keep Brittany out of a jail cell, and cover the mounting legal fees from a dozen furious investors who were now filing class action civil suits. Their usual safety nets had vanished. The wealthy friends they normally relied on for discreet bridge loans had read the financial blogs and stopped returning their calls. The country club socialites who used to clamor for Brittany's attention now looked the other way when Patricia walked into the dining room. William had spent the last 20 days frantically pulling every string he had left, only to find that his powerful connections had severed all ties the moment the word embezzlement hit the financial news cycle. They were entirely isolated, drowning in toxic debt, and rapidly running out of time before the federal prosecutors officially filed criminal charges. The desperate need for cash forced William into a corner he had never occupied in his entire privileged life. He had to seek funding outside the traditional banking system. Traditional financial institutions laughed William out of their offices. His credit was inextricably linked to Brittany's failing empire, and no reputable bank would touch a family under active federal investigation. Driven by overwhelming desperation and a toxic refusal to admit defeat, William turned to the shadow market of private equity. He spent nights scouring alternative lending networks searching for anyone willing to provide immediate, unrestricted capital without a rigorous federal background check. He finally found a willing lender in a blind private equity firm called Vanguard Holdings LLC. Vanguard operated quietly, offering rapid liquidity to high net worth individuals facing sudden financial distress. The terms they offered were brutally predatory. They agreed to front William the exact amount required to satisfy the immediate IRS liens and secure Brittany's criminal defense retainers. In exchange, the loan carried a staggering 20% interest rate and a strictly enforced 6-month repayment window. There were no grace periods, no negotiation clauses, and no extensions. But the most dangerous element of the contract was the collateral requirement. Vanguard Holdings demanded the deed to the Greenwich Mansion. The sprawling multi-million-dollar estate was the last untainted asset the family possessed. It was the physical manifestation of their social supremacy, the crown jewel of Patricia's curated reality. William knew that signing the property over as collateral was corporate suicide. If he defaulted on the brutal 6-month timeline, Vanguard would immediately seize the estate and evict them. He sat in his dark mahogany-paneled home office, staring at the thick stack of loan documents delivered by a private courier. His hands trembled slightly as he held his gold-plated fountain pen. He had always believed he was the smartest man in any room, a master manipulator of capital and leverage. Now he was signing away his family home to an anonymous corporate entity just to keep his daughter out of federal prison. He flipped to the final page of the contract, his eyes scanning the harsh legal language outlining the absolute forfeiture of the property in the event of default. The heavy silence of the empty house pressed down on him. With a tight, bitter grimace, William pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name on the dotted line, legally binding his most valuable asset to a faceless creditor. Patricia entered the dim office just as William closed the leather portfolio. She walked up behind his heavy chair, placing her manicured hands gently on his tense shoulders. She looked at the signed documents and let out a long, shaky breath of relief. "It is just a short-term bridge loan," Patricia murmured softly, her voice dripping with the same practiced delusion she used to shield herself from reality. "We have exactly what we need to save Brittany. We will simply liquidate some of the secondary assets next year, restructure the remaining debt, and pay this off entirely. This is just a minor bump in the road. Nobody at the country club will ever know we had to borrow against the house. Our reputation remains completely intact." William nodded his head slowly, desperately choosing to believe her deeply comforting lies. He slid the signed contract into the return envelope, entirely unaware of the dangerous entity he had just sold his soul to. If he had dug just one layer deeper into the Vanguard Holdings LLC registration, he would have found the parent corporation. He would have clearly seen that the blind trust traced directly back to a subsidiary of my own enterprise, Sienna Holding Company. The passage of time did nothing to dilute the staggering arrogance of my family. As the brutal winter thawed into a crisp Greenwich spring, Patricia simply doubled down on the delusion. The 6-month clock on the predatory bridge loan was quietly ticking in the background, but to anyone observing from the outside, the estate remained a bastion of untouchable generational wealth. Patricia refused to cancel her annual philanthropic garden party, viewing it as the ultimate battlefield to control the narrative. She transformed the sprawling manicured lawns into a lavish spectacle of catered champagne, imported orchids, and classical string quartets, determined to project absolute financial supremacy to her wealthy peers. She hired a fleet of valets to park their sports cars and commissioned a towering ice sculpture that slowly melted onto the pristine patio. She glided effortlessly between intimate clusters of highly affluent socialites in a custom silk designer gown, clutching a sparkling crystal flute and expertly spinning a masterful web of carefully calculated lies. Whenever the conversation inevitably turned toward the abrupt collapse of Brittany Botanicals, Patricia waved her manicured hand with practiced, dismissive ease. She told everyone that Brittany was simply entering an exclusive rebranding phase. She claimed the cosmetic line had grown too quickly, and they were strategically pivoting toward a highly selective European distribution model to better serve their elite clientele and maintain the supreme exclusivity of the brand. Brittany stood nearby, forcing a rigid, unblinking smile as her mother fabricated a glamorous cover story for her catastrophic failure. After the guests finally left, William paced the empty living room, sick with anxiety over the impending balloon payment. Patricia smoothly intercepted him, wrapping her arms around his rigid shoulders to soothe his growing terror. "It is just a 6-month bridge loan," she reassured William, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. "We will simply sell some secondary assets next year and pay it off entirely. Nobody at the entire country club will ever know we had to leverage the main house. This is just a temporary inconvenience." She was utterly convinced that if they just looked the part, the universe would naturally align to protect their status. But the vibrant illusion instantly shattered the moment they stepped away from the meticulously curated parties. Behind the heavy oak doors of the mansion, they were suffocating. The crushing reality of the balloon payment loomed over them like a dark storm cloud. William had spent the last 4 months aggressively trying to leverage his remaining contacts to secure a traditional refinancing option to pay off the toxic Vanguard loan. He desperately needed a legitimate bank to absorb the massive debt before the brutal 6-month deadline expired, but every single door was violently slammed in his face. The financial drought was entirely self-inflicted, accelerated by the spectacular, highly public implosion of Brittany's personal life. Malik had not just brilliantly flipped sides during the intense corporate investigation. He had filed for a brutally aggressive scorched earth divorce. Malik's relentless legal team filed hundreds of pages of public depositions detailing the exact nature of the cosmetic company's financial fraud, the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, and the predatory loan guarantees. The divorce filings quickly became mandatory reading among the Greenwich elite. The devastatingly detailed documents stripped away every last shred of the family's respectability. William quickly discovered that his decades of country club networking were completely useless when his name became synonymous with federal tax liens and corporate embezzlement. The powerful private equity partners who used to invite him to their luxury suites now instructed their assistants to permanently block his calls. His golf buddies suddenly resigned from joint ventures, citing vague structural conflicts to avoid any toxic association. The isolation was absolute. William sat isolated in his dim, cavernous office, night after agonizing night, staring blankly at sprawling spreadsheets that offered zero viable solutions. The assets Patricia had blithely promised to sell off were either frozen by the ongoing IRS audit or hopelessly depreciated. They had zero liquid capital. They had alienated every single ally. The walls of their multi-million-dollar fortress were rapidly closing in, and William was entirely powerless to stop the impending collapse. Exactly 1 week before the brutal 6-month loan deadline, the inevitable catastrophic consequence of their staggeringly arrogant negligence finally arrived. A sleek, unmarked black car slowly pulled up to the imposing wrought iron security gates of the Greenwich estate. A silent courier stepped out, approached the heavy mahogany front doors, and handed William a stark black envelope. There was no return address, only a thick wax seal binding the flap. William ripped the envelope open, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out the single sheet of premium cardstock. It was a formal notice of default. The document stated in cold clinical legal terms that Vanguard Holdings, LLC, was initiating the immediate seizure of the Greenwich estate due to the imminent failure to satisfy the loan terms. The brutal eviction protocols would commence in exactly 7 days, stripping the family of their final, most precious remaining asset. Panic clawed fiercely at William's throat. He sprinted back to his mahogany-paneled office, grabbed his phone, and frantically dialed the emergency contact number listed at the bottom of the eviction notice. He was fully prepared to beg to offer exorbitant penalty fees, to promise absolutely anything in exchange for a 30-day extension. The line rang twice before clicking over. William opened his mouth to eagerly negotiate, but he was instantly silenced by a cold, automated voice. The metallic recording informed him that Vanguard Holdings, LLC, did not accept negotiation requests. Extensions were strictly prohibited, and the asset seizure protocol was locked and irreversible. The line went completely dead, leaving William paralyzed with absolute terror as he desperately flipped the document over to inspect the corporate letterhead. The camera reveals the name of the Blind, LLC, printed at the very bottom of the page. It traces back directly to a subsidiary of Sienna's holding company. The 30-day cure period mandated by Vanguard Holdings expired with agonizing speed, transforming the Greenwich estate from a sanctuary of generational wealth into a suffocating financial prison. William and Patricia scrambled through the cavernous halls of their mansion in a state of unhinged frenzy. The sheer scale of their monetary hemorrhage was staggering. They attempted to quickly liquidate everything that was not physically bolted to the marble floors, but the stark reality of their situation was far bleaker than Patricia's ridiculous garden party delusions. Brittany's impending federal prosecution had absolutely gutted their remaining cash reserves. The highly specialized criminal defense team they hired to keep their golden child out of a federal penitentiary demanded an astronomical upfront retainer. Every single dollar they scraped together from selling Patricia's exclusive designer jewelry collections, the imported luxury vehicles, and the antique European art went directly into the eager pockets of ruthless defense attorneys. It was a terrifying bottomless pit of legal expenses that yielded zero guarantees of keeping Brittany completely free from incarceration. William spent his miserable days frantically dialing numbers from his meticulously curated contact list, begging former colleagues and country club associates to purchase their secondary assets at severely discounted rates. Nobody answered. The social exile was absolute and complete. The once powerful patriarch of the family was reduced to a desperate pariah isolated in his dim office as the eviction clock ticked down to its final hours. The mansion felt entirely hollow, stripped of its valuable artifacts, and echoing with the haunting sound of Patricia's constant muffled sobbing from the master suite. They were drowning in a toxic sea of debt, and the realization that their elite status was permanently gone finally shattered William's ironclad pride. He stared at the foreclosure documents scattered across his mahogany desk, the bold black lettering mocking his decades of arrogant supremacy. Vanguard Holdings remained a faceless, impenetrable wall of corporate rejection, completely immune to his desperate pleas for an extension. The realization hit him with brutal physical force. He was entirely out of options, out of favors, and completely out of time. The banks had frozen their remaining accounts. The federal investigators were circling closer every single day, and the balloon payment was completely out of reach. William buried his face in his trembling hands, the crushing weight of total ruin pressing down on his chest. There was only one person left in the world with the liquid capital necessary to bail them out. He picked up his phone, his trembling fingers hovering over a contact he had sworn to ignore for the rest of his miserable life. Swallowing his immense, suffocating pride, William tapped my name and slowly placed the phone to his ear. He listened to the steady ringing, entirely unaware that the massive debt currently destroying his life was completely controlled by the very woman he was attempting to call. He still firmly believed Vanguard Holdings was just a merciless, faceless private equity firm operating blindly in the financial shadows. When I finally answered, the heavy silence on the line was thick and heavily laden with unspoken, bitter hostility. Sienna Williams said, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar, deeply desperate fragility. I know we have had our profound differences in the past, but I am calling you right now as your father. We are entirely out of viable options. A predatory lending firm is initiating an aggressively rapid foreclosure on the Greenwich estate by midnight tonight. We are going to lose absolutely everything: the house, the property, the last remaining symbol of our family legacy. I need a loan, Sienna. I desperately need a massive cash injection immediately to satisfy the default terms and keep a solid roof over our heads. He gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his usual corporate arrogance. He practically begged, pushing all of his chips into the center of the table, desperately attempting to leverage misplaced nostalgia and deep-rooted guilt to secure my financial salvation. "You simply cannot let them take your childhood home," William pleaded, his tone oozing with a sudden, sickeningly cloying sentimentality. "This is the exact house you grew up in. It holds our collective history, our memories." Patricia is absolutely devastated, and Brittany is completely falling apart under the severe stress of the federal audits. "We are your family, Sienna. We share the very same blood. You possess the capital to easily fix this entire nightmare with a single wire transfer. I am begging you to show some compassion and step up to protect your family name before it is completely erased forever." I sat silently in my high-rise office, listening to the frantic, panicked breathing of the man who had spent my entire existence ensuring I felt remarkably small and entirely insignificant. I let his desperate pleas hang heavily in the dead air, savoring the absolute reversal of our established dynamic. He was waiting for me to grant him mercy, to offer the forgiveness he had never once extended to anyone else. When I finally spoke, my voice was razor-thin and ice-cold, carrying the immense weight of years of accumulated rejection. "You told me my presence in that house was a waste of space," I replied, repeating the exact vicious words he had used to dismiss my inherent worth so many years ago. "I wouldn't dream of taking up space there again." I firmly pressed the red button on my sleek phone, permanently severing the connection before he could ever utter another pathetic word. The absolute silence that rapidly followed was profoundly beautiful. Across the vast city in the dim, empty study of the Greenwich estate, William stared blankly at his cellular phone, his final remaining lifeline completely severed. The heavy, antique grandfather clock, situated in the hallway, began to chime, echoing loudly through the stripped, totally dark and barren mansion. The legal clock finally struck 0, locking the catastrophic consequences into absolute reality. The foreclosure was officially finalized. The morning sun broke over the Greenwich skyline, casting a golden glow across the sprawling, manicured lawns of the neighborhood. It was a picture-perfect Tuesday, the kind of crisp, idyllic suburban morning where the elite residents of the gated community engaged in their meticulously scheduled routines. Across the street, Eleanor Vanderbilt Power walked her pair of purebred Afghan hounds in matching designer athleisure, while the Harrisons' private landscaping crew quietly trimmed the hedges to exacting geometric standards. The air smelled of fresh dew and absolute privilege. It was a world fundamentally insulated from consequence, or so the residents fiercely believed. That immaculate tranquility was violently shattered at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. The heavy silence of the affluent neighborhood was broken by the aggressive crunch of heavy tires turning onto the long, crushed gravel driveway of William and Patricia's estate. It was not the familiar purr of a delivery van or a private caterer. It was a fleet of official municipal vehicles. 2 Greenwich police cruisers, their light bars flashing a silent warning, flanked a massive black sheriff's SUV. They rolled past the towering wrought iron security gates, which had been locked open and parked at aggressive haphazard angles directly in front of the grand mahogany entrance. The visual impact of law enforcement vehicles parked on the estate's circular driveway sent an immediate, electrifying shockwave through the neighborhood. Eleanor Vanderbilt stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured grip tightening on her leather dog leashes as her eyes widened in undisguised shock. 2 other neighbors, sipping imported espresso on their elevated terraces, stepped forward to peer through the oak trees. In a community where discretion was the ultimate currency, the arrival of police cruisers was the equivalent of a nuclear detonation. The spectacle was entirely unavoidable. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, adjusting their utility belts, their expressions hardened and profoundly unbothered by the sheer wealth surrounding them. The sheriff, A towering man with a thick silver mustache and a thick stack of manila folders tucked under his arm marched up the pristine limestone steps. He did not ring the doorbell or wait for a valet. He raised a heavy fist and pounded on the custom mahogany door with a forceful, echoing thud that completely shattered the final remaining illusion of the family's untouchable status. The heavy oak door was violently yanked open from the inside. Patricia stood in the grand entryway, her eyes bloodshot and wide with absolute unhinged panic. She was stripped of her usual curated glamour, wearing only a hastily tied emerald silk sleeping robe, her hair disheveled, and her bare feet standing on the cold marble threshold. She took one look at the heavily armed officers standing on her pristine porch, and the stark glaring reality of her absolute ruin physically slammed into her chest. Then her frantic gaze darted past the officers locking onto Eleanor Vanderbilt and the other neighbors openly staring from the sidewalk. A visceral, sickening wave of ultimate humiliation washed over Patricia, but her deeply ingrained survival instinct for social preservation instantly hijacked her spiraling brain. She lunged forward, throwing her body into the doorway, her manicured hands desperately attempting to block the sheriff as he raised a thick roll of heavy-duty tape and a bright yellow legal document. "You absolutely cannot do this here." Patricia hissed, her voice a shrill whisper, designed to evade the eagerly listening ears of her wealthy neighbors. "This is a massive mistake. You need to leave my property this very second before I have your badges revoked." "Ma'am, step aside," the sheriff commanded, his voice booming across the perfectly trimmed hedges, ensuring every spectator heard him loud and clear. Patricia practically shoved her back against the doorframe, flashing a wide, utterly manic smile toward Eleanor across the street. She raised her voice, adopting a sickly sweet, high-pitched tone of mock exasperation. "It is just a ridiculous clerical error with the bank," Patricia yelled, waving her hand with a frantic, trembling dismissal. "You know how completely incompetent these massive financial institutions can be. They transposed an account number, and now they are putting on this entire theatrical display over a simple administrative glitch. We will have it completely sorted out with our wealth managers by noon." She turned her vicious, cornered glare back to the sheriff, dropping the volume and baring her teeth like a rabid animal. "I am ordering you to stop this immediately," Patricia snarled, grabbing at the sleeve of his uniform. "My husband is on the phone with the bank president right now. If you dare tape that notice to my door, I will personally ruin you." She was completely unraveling, desperately clinging to a fabricated reality that had officially ceased to exist. The sheriff did not flinch. He easily brushed Patricia's trembling hand away from his uniform with a practiced, totally apathetic motion. He stepped squarely into her space, towering over her fragile, frantic frame, and slapped the bright yellow eviction notice directly onto the center of the custom mahogany door. He smoothed the heavy tape down with deliberate, agonizing slowness, sealing her absolute public destruction. "Ma'am, there is no clerical error," the sheriff stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that echoed sharply across the silent, watching street. "The property was seized by the holding company at exactly midnight. Your family is entirely out of time, out of appeals, and officially trespassing. The new owner is en route to take immediate physical possession of the estate, and we are ordered to ensure the premises are completely vacated before they arrive." Patricia's jaw dropped, her manicured hands trembling wildly as the color completely drained from her face. She stood paralyzed, shattered by the cold, devastating finality of the law. Before she could force another desperate lie from her throat, the heavy silence of the morning was suddenly shattered. A deep, aggressive, vibrating rumble of a heavy engine echoed from the very end of the street, steadily growing louder and closer. The low, guttural growl of a twin turbo V12 engine vibrated through the manicured oak trees lining the street. The heavy sound completely drowned out Patricia's frantic, breathless stammering. A sleek, obsidian-black Mercedes Maybach glided into view, its polished chrome accents catching the morning sun like a freshly sharpened blade. It moved with the predatory grace of a shark cutting through shallow water, effortlessly navigating the turn through the open wrought-iron security gates. The massive vehicle crawled up the crushed gravel driveway, the heavy tires crushing the pristine white stones with a slow, deliberate crunch that echoed loudly. It rolled past the two flashing police cruisers and came to a smooth, calculated halt directly behind the sheriff's imposing SUV, completely blocking the circular exit. The visual of the ultra-luxury vehicle sitting nose to tail with law enforcement sent a secondary shockwave through the affluent audience across the street. Eleanor Vanderbilt lowered her designer sunglasses, her mouth hanging slightly open as she shamelessly stared. The local private landscaping crew entirely stopped their trimmers, standing perfectly still in the grass. This was no longer just a financial scandal. It was an undeniable, highly public spectacle unfolding in real time. The front door of the estate swung wider. Brittany stumbled out onto the limestone porch, wrapping a cashmere cardigan tightly around her fragile, trembling frame. Her eyes were sunken and hollowed out by weeks of intense federal audits and crippling anxiety. She stood beside her mother, both women frozen like statues on their own front steps. Patricia clutched the lapels of her emerald silk robe, her chest heaving as she stared at the tinted, impenetrable windows of the Maybach. Her carefully constructed reality was actively collapsing around her ankles. She had spent decades cultivating an image of absolute superiority, insulating herself behind these expensive brick walls, and now the entire neighborhood was watching her empire burn to the ground. William stumbled out behind them, his face a pale, sickly shade of gray. His tie was loosened, his expensive dress shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night spent pacing his office. He clutched the side of the heavy mahogany doorframe to steady his shaking legs. He stared at the gleaming Maybach, his mind frantically trying to process who had arrived to claim his most prized possession. The holding company was supposed to be a cold, faceless entity, a giant corporate machine. This felt entirely too personal. The driver's side door of the Maybach clicked open. A man in a sharp-tailored black suit stepped out onto the crushed gravel. He did not look at the sheriff, the police officers, or the shattered family standing on the porch. He moved with strict military precision around the rear of the vehicle and reached for the passenger door handle. The silence in the driveway was absolute, broken only by the morning breeze rustling through the ancient oak branches. He pulled the heavy armored door open, stepping back respectfully. I stepped out of the deep, leather interior, planting my stiletto heel firmly onto the pristine gravel. I wore a flawless, tailored ivory cashmere coat draped perfectly over a sharp, charcoal gray business suit, exuding an aura of untouchable, ruthless authority. My hair was styled in a sleek, immaculate blowout, and my posture was completely rigid with absolute confidence. I did not look like the discarded, scapegoated daughter they had banished from their lives so many years ago. I looked like the exact corporate executioner they had always feared. In my right hand, I casually held a single thick manila folder containing the absolute unassailable legal transfer of the Greenwich estate. I closed the car door behind me and slowly began walking up the driveway. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone, a steady, terrifying metronome counting down the final seconds of their dynasty. The sheriff immediately stepped aside, recognizing the legal owner of the property he was currently securing. I did not rush. I took my time, allowing my family to fully absorb the reality of the woman walking toward them. I stopped precisely at the bottom of the limestone steps, looking up at the three people who had made my childhood a living nightmare. William's jaw literally dropped, his mouth hanging open in slack-jawed, uncomprehending horror. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically from my face to the thick manila folder resting in my hand, and then directly to the bright yellow eviction notice taped to the mahogany door. I could physically see the catastrophic realization crashing through his brain as the disparate pieces finally snapped together. The predatory lending firm, the anonymous Vanguard Holdings, LLC, the ruthless 20% interest rate, the absolutely unforgiving collateral demands. It had never been a faceless corporation. You, William choked out his voice, a breathless, strangled wheeze. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grip the doorframe harder just to stay standing. You are the LLC. Patricia let out a sharp, hysterical gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth as her eyes bulged with terrified recognition. Brittany shrank back against the brick wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the power shift. They were staring at the daughter they had relentlessly abused, the sister they had systematically discarded, the outcast who now legally owned the very ground they were standing on. I did not offer them a shred of pity, nor did I raise my voice. I simply looked past their trembling bodies, my gaze sweeping over the grand towering columns of the massive Greenwich mansion. The morning sun illuminated the sheer perfection of the home they had weaponized against me for decades. I soaked in the devastation painted across their pale faces, deeply relishing the absolute certainty that they had engineered their own flawless demise. They had demanded I leave their presence, and I had returned to buy the very roof over their heads. I smiled, letting a bright expression of unadulterated victory settle upon my features. I always thought this place needed new management. Patricia's initial shock morphed instantly into a feral, unhinged rage. Her face flushed a violent mottled crimson as she realized the magnitude of the trap they had willingly walked into. She lunged forward, her silk robe billowing wildly, her manicured fingers curled into desperate claws as if she intended to physically rip the truth out of the morning air. She screamed that this was an elaborate setup, a highly illegal scheme orchestrated by a jealous, bitter child. Her voice broke, climbing to a hysterical pitch that echoed off the surrounding estates, accusing me of federal crimes, fraud, and corporate espionage. She demanded the sheriff arrest me on the spot, shrieking that I had somehow hacked into Vanguard Holdings to steal their family home. William tried to grab her arm to silence her, his legal instincts kicking in far too late, but Patricia violently shook him off. She ranted that the paperwork was forged, that I had no legal authority to stand on their driveway, and that she would unleash a legion of attorneys to bury me under a mountain of lawsuits. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or entertain her manic delusions. I simply turned my attention away from her screaming face and walked directly toward the sheriff. He stood perfectly still, watching the chaotic display of suburban entitlement with a hardened, unimpressed glare. I calmly extended my hand, presenting the thick manila folder I had carried from the Maybach. I instructed the sheriff to review the contents. Inside was the original unredacted deed to the Greenwich estate, the fully executed loan agreement, and the universally binding forfeiture clause. The documents clearly displayed William's unmistakable notarized signature on every single page. I watched the sheriff carefully inspect the corporate seals, the dates, and the transfer of deed documentation that officially granted Vanguard Holdings, and by direct extension, Sienna Holding Company, absolute possession of the property. Everything was 100% legal, strictly bound by the exact predatory terms William had desperately agreed to. There was no setup, no fraud, and no hidden trickery. He had willingly signed the contract. The sheriff closed the folder, nodded his head in absolute confirmation, and stepped back silently, handing the undeniable authority of the situation entirely over to me. Patricia's screams abruptly died in her throat as she watched the legal officer side with the woman she had spent her entire life trying to destroy. With the legal reality firmly established, I bypassed my speechless father and my hyperventilating mother, stepping smoothly onto the pristine limestone porch. My designer heels clicked with finality as I stopped directly in front of Brittany. My golden sister looked completely unrecognizable. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a tangled, greasy mess, her posture hunched and defeated. The arrogant, untouchable girl who had forged my signature and attempted to ruin my life was completely gone, replaced by a trembling, terrified woman entirely stripped of her expensive armor. She shrank back against the heavy mahogany doorframe, her wide eyes darting frantically, desperately looking for someone to rescue her. But there was no one left. The high-priced lawyers had taken their money, her affluent social circle had abandoned her to the federal prosecutors, and her parents were entirely powerless. I looked her up and down, savoring the poetic justice of the moment. "You spent your entire life believing you were inherently superior? I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the crisp morning air like shattered glass. You wanted to live in a mansion, drive imported cars, and command respect without ever actually working for a single piece of it. You thought you could simply steal capital forged documents and let someone else take the fall when the foundation inevitably cracked. Brittany opened her mouth to speak a pathetic, strangled sob, escaping her lips, but I immediately raised my hand to silence her. You calculated that fear and family loyalty would protect you. I continued, my gaze locking onto her terrified eyes. You thought you could orchestrate massive corporate fraud and simply smile your way out of federal prison. But that illusion is over. You built a house of cards on a foundation of theft and greed. Now you have absolutely nothing. I want you to look around this estate, Brittany. Look at the manicured lawns, the imported statues, the grand entrance. Take a long, hard look, because you will never step foot on this property again. And the beautiful irony is that I did not ruin you. I did not force you to embezzle millions, and I did not force your father to sign away this house. Your own greed did. You engineered your own absolute destruction. Brittany buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the crushing weight of her reality finally broke her spirit. I turned away from her sobbing figure and looked back down at William and Patricia. I slowly pulled back the cuff of my ivory cashmere coat, exposing the heavy diamond-encrusted face of my luxury watch. The morning sunlight caught the flawless jewels, throwing brilliant refractions across the porch. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack whatever you can carry in your hands. I announced, my tone stripped of any lingering familial connection. The custom furniture, the antique European art collections, and that leased luxury Porsche sitting in the garage belong to my company now. They are legally seized corporate assets to satisfy your outstanding debt. If you attempt to remove anything of value, the sheriff will arrest you for theft. William stood completely paralyzed, the blood drained from his face as the sheer brutality of my ultimatum finalized his total financial annihilation. The towering patriarch was reduced to an empty, defeated shell. Patricia let out a guttural, agonizing wail. Her legs finally gave out, and she collapsed heavily onto her knees right on the cold, hard limestone. She threw her hands forward, openly weeping and desperately begging for mercy as the cold legal clock ticked down. I looked down at Patricia sobbing on the cold limestone and felt absolutely nothing. The woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless was now groveling at my feet, her manicured hands desperately grasping at the hem of my cashmere coat. I calmly stepped back out of her reach and gestured to the two massive private security contractors who had quietly stepped out of the Maybach behind me. The timer is running, I said, my voice echoing in the crisp morning air. 29 minutes left. William grabbed his wife by the arms, hauling her up from the stone. His face was a mask of pure terror and humiliation. He practically dragged Patricia through the grand mahogany doors, with Brittany sprinting blindly ahead of them into the cavernous foyer. I followed them inside my security detail, flanking me, their heavy boots thudding against the imported Italian marble. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand entryway, crossing my arms over my chest as the sheer, unadulterated chaos unfolded. It was a frantic, pathetic display. William darted into his home office, grabbing a handful of cheap canvas duffel bags they used for gym clothes, tossing one to Patricia and another to Brittany. The manicured, composed matriarch of the family shrieked as she ran up the sweeping spiral staircase, tripping over the hem of her silk robe. I watched William frantically pulling open the drawers of his mahogany desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the handles. He grabbed a handful of custom-engraved gold pens and a vintage Rolex from the top drawer, shoving them toward his pocket. "Put them back, William," I ordered, my voice cutting through his panic like a whip. "Those items were purchased with company funds. They remain with the property." My security guard immediately stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on William's shoulder. William swallowed hard, his eyes darting wildly before his trembling fingers dropped the luxury items back onto the desk. Upstairs, the sounds of absolute hysteria echoed down the hallways. Patricia was screaming at Brittany, fighting over space in the cheap duffel bags, frantically stuffing handfuls of wrinkled clothing into the nylon sacks. They threw designer heels and silk blouses into the bags in a desperate frenzy. Brittany sprinted down the stairs, her arms overflowing with tangled clothes, a heavy silver candlestick clutched tightly in her fist. "Drop the silver, Brittany," I commanded without breaking eye contact. She froze on the bottom step, her chest heaving before tossing the antique fixture onto the floor with a loud metallic clatter. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour. "Your time is officially up," I announced. My security team immediately moved in, forcing the three of them toward the front entrance. Patricia clutched her bulging, overstuffed duffel bag against her chest, her face streaked with mascara and tears. William stumbled forward, carrying a mismatched nylon tote, his expensive leather loafers dragging against the floorboards. Brittany sobbed openly, clutching her belongings like a terrified child. They moved out onto the limestone porch, expecting to load their miserable sacks into one of their luxury vehicles. William reached into his pocket and frantically pressed the unlock button on his key fob, staring at the closed garage doors. Nothing happened. I stepped out onto the porch behind them, flanked by the sheriff. "I told you, William, the leased Porsche and the Range Rover were seized to satisfy the massive debt you accumulated. The vehicles legally belong to Vanguard Holdings now. You do not have transportation." The realization hit William like a physical blow to the stomach. He stared at me in total disbelieving horror. "You expect us to walk?" he gasped, his voice cracking under the weight of his absolute defeat. I simply raised a single eyebrow, offering zero sympathy. "I expect you to vacate my property immediately," I replied. The sheriff stepped forward, placing his hand on his utility belt. "You heard the owner," he barked, gesturing toward the long, crushed gravel driveway. "Start walking." Patricia let out another agonizing, hysterical wail, realizing the sheer, unmitigated horror of their situation. The grand, sweeping driveway they had proudly paved to intimidate guests was now their personal path of ultimate humiliation. With nowhere left to turn and the police standing ready to arrest them for trespassing, they had no choice. William, his shoulders completely slumped, took the first agonizing step down the driveway, the cheap duffel bag bumping awkwardly against his knees. Patricia followed her bare feet, struggling on the sharp gravel, weeping loudly with every single step. Brittany trudged behind them, her head hung completely down, dragging her bag across the stones. They walked down the massive expanse of the estate, their figures growing smaller and more pathetic as they approached the towering wrought iron gates. The physical exertion of carrying their heavy, unorganized bags quickly took a toll on their pampered bodies. William was sweating profusely, his breathing labored and ragged. Patricia stumbled, nearly dropping her bag, but William did not stop to help her. As they passed through the open security gates and spilled out onto the perfectly manicured sidewalk of the neighborhood, the true punishment began. Eleanor Vanderbilt stood completely motionless on her pristine lawn, her designer dog sitting quietly by her side. Three other prominent country club members had stepped out of their sprawling estates, standing at the edges of their driveways. They did not offer help. They did not ask questions. They simply watched in stunned, judgmental silence as the mighty Wilson family dragged their cheap luggage down the public street on foot like common vagrants. Patricia looked up, making direct eye contact with Eleanor. The absolute social death registering in that single silent exchange was permanently devastating. Patricia lowered her head, weeping into her hands as she hobbled away. I stood on the grand limestone porch, watching them disappear down the affluent street. I smiled softly, then stepped inside and firmly locked the heavy oak door. The heavy oak doors of the downtown Manhattan federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the courtroom in a thick, oppressive silence. Malik sat rigidly at the polished mahogany defense table, the harsh fluorescent lighting casting deep shadows under his exhausted eyes. For months, the suffocating weight of federal prison had hung over his head, a terrifying fate meticulously engineered by the woman sitting at the opposite table. Brittany had orchestrated a massive, highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme and flawlessly framed him to take the absolute fall. But today, the narrative was violently and permanently course-corrected. Beside Malik sat a pair of the most ruthless, incredibly expensive corporate defense attorneys on the eastern seaboard, their astronomical retainers paid in full by Sienna. They did not need to argue passionately or posture for the jury. They simply let the hard, undeniable evidence do the heavy lifting. The lead attorney stood up and formally submitted the contents of the encrypted flash drive Sienna had retrieved from the Greenwich estate. The drive was a digital graveyard of Brittany's staggering arrogance. It contained every single deleted email, every hidden offshore ledger, and undeniable proof of her forging Malik's signature on dozens of fraudulent tax documents. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate financial deception, scrolled through the meticulously organized files on her monitor. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as she reviewed the absolute decimation of Brittany's fabricated lies. The judge finally looked up, her sharp gaze locking onto Malik with a definitive nod of professional understanding. She struck her wooden gavel with a sharp, echoing crack that resonated loudly through the large, beautifully polished room. All federal charges against Malik were officially and immediately dismissed with prejudice. He was entirely exonerated, completely severed from the sprawling IRS nightmare that was about to swallow his former wife whole. Malik let out a long, shuddering breath, burying his face in his trembling hands, as the crushing, suffocating terror of wrongful incarceration instantly evaporated into the cold air. He was a truly free man. His name, his career, and his personal reputation legally and permanently wiped clean. Directly following the federal exoneration, the adjacent family court handled the legal dissolution of his toxic marriage with the same brutal, uncompromising efficiency. Because Brittany was legally documented as the sole malicious orchestrator of the massive financial fraud, the judge aggressively favored Malik in the ensuing divorce settlement. The marriage was officially dissolved in absolute record time. Malik walked away completely unburdened, while Brittany was legally anchored to the towering, inescapable mountain of debt she had manufactured in her desperate bid to maintain her fake billionaire lifestyle. The court formally and permanently stripped her of any claim to his future earnings, his savings, or his personal assets, and assigned her 100% liability for the staggering IRS penalties. Malik pushed through the heavy courtroom doors and stepped out into the expansive marble-lined corridor, taking his first breath of true freedom. He stopped dead in his tracks. Sienna stood quietly near a towering marble pillar, her arms crossed over her flawlessly tailored suit, silently watching the legal proceedings wrap up from the shadows of the hallway. Malik walked slowly toward her, his posture straight, the heavy burden of his disastrous marriage finally completely gone. They did not need to exchange a single spoken word or engage in a dramatic, overly emotional embrace. Malik simply stopped a few feet away and offered a deep, profound nod of absolute, genuine appreciation. Sienna held his gaze and returned the gesture with a subtle, deeply respectful tilt of the chin, quietly acknowledging that her debt to him was officially and forever paid in full. Inside the courtroom, the final crushing blow was mercilessly delivered to the fallen golden child. Brittany stood before the federal judge, trembling violently, in a cheap, poorly tailored gray suit that hung awkwardly on her shrinking, defeated frame. The federal judge leaned far forward over the high wooden bench, delivering a scathing, relentless, and highly public reprimand regarding her unmitigated greed, her criminal deception, and her staggering suburban entitlement. Brittany managed to avoid a federal penitentiary sentence by a dangerously narrow, miraculous margin. But the alternative she was handed was a completely different kind of suffocating prison. The judge forcefully sentenced her to 5,000 hours of grueling mandatory community service, ensuring her days of luxury manicures and exclusive country club lunches were permanently replaced by exhausting menial physical labor. Furthermore, she was legally ordered to pay absolute, massive financial restitution directly back to the Internal Revenue Service, a corporate debt so astronomically high she would be aggressively garnishing her minimum wage earnings for the rest of her natural life. To permanently seal her professional coffin, the judge issued a strict, legally binding federal injunction that absolutely barred Brittany from ever holding a corporate officer position, managing financial accounts, or opening any registered business ever again. Her corporate career was completely dead-buried under the heavy weight of her own hubris. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sound block one final echoing time, permanently locking the catastrophic life-altering consequences into absolute reality. The once untouchable, wildly arrogant golden child was publicly reduced to a federally monitored, destitute debtor with zero future prospects. Across the vast, unforgiving city, the absolute and total decimation of the once powerful family was finally complete. William, Patricia, and Brittany were permanently exiled from their elite, gated society, entirely stripped of their generational wealth, their stolen corporate assets, and their carefully manufactured, fragile dignity. They had spent their entire lives treating everyone else as disposable stepping stones, completely blind to the very obvious fact that they were slowly building their own inevitable trap. Now the heavy steel trap had violently snapped completely shut, severing them from their golden pedestal. They were left utterly alone in the cold, empty dark, staring blankly into the terrifying void, clutching absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable reality of their own permanent, completely absolute ruin.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly, I am